Welcome to No Sleep, where the night never ends, and every whisper in the dark could be something real. Tonight's story isn't just horror. It's a memory, a warning, a door that should have stayed closed. So turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and whatever you do, don't fall asleep. I flew in with a grant, a suitcase of microphones, and a righteous sense of academic purpose. The American cocktail for doing fieldwork in a place your college friends need to Google. The Karajóm Peninsula looked like a map someone had worried between their teeth. Ragged bays, tin roofs bent in the wind, laundry lines strung like staff paper along alleys that smelled of diesel and salt. I kept telling myself I was here to preserve something fragile, to save a language from the cliff edge. That's what the application said anyway. Documentation of a moribund coastal tongue. Check the box, defend the budget. By the second day, I understood I had not come to a deathbed. I'd walked into a locked room. They called it the chant-without-tongue. Fewer than 8 speakers, everyone past 70, each person carrying a library of vowels that never fully left their mouths. The sound lived more in the throat than on the lips, a pressure you felt in your sternum before you heard it with your ears. When I asked for translations, they gave me glances that looked like they were weighing my bones. And then, almost always, the same line, patient and fatal. Some words were not meant to be remembered. I put it down as metaphor in my notebook. Trauma, colonialism, an old story of silence told with new diction. That's the thing about being trained in America. You can make any warning sound like literature until it kills you. The first elder willing to sit with me was a man named Okur. He had feet like coral and a face whose creases had learned to keep secrets. He chose the rocks by the tide line because he said the air there was truthful. We sat on a salt-whitened ledge while waves shouldered the shore below like cattle. I clipped a lav to his collar, checked levels, asked for something simple, described the sunrise in the chant, the color of it, the shape. He breathed in the way a man prays before he lies. Then he let out a single breath that rode the end of the exhale like a fish finning the surface. I didn't recognize it as a word. Not at first. No consonants to hang a hat on. No vowel I could triangulate. Just a soft pressure that made the hair on my wrist bristle beneath the watchband. The waveform on my recorder barely registered. A hill of dust. I marked the timestamp anyway. You learn to archive everything. It's the religion and the sin. Back in my room above the harbor, I plugged the recorder into my laptop and queued up the file. The fans of the old machine whined like a mosquito you can't find. The room smelled of brine and the soap the house used to fight it. Outside, the evening folded itself into the sea the way a knife folds into a pocket. I've looked at more sound files than vacation photos. I know the shapes of human voices, the way a cardiologist knows the slopes of heartbeats. What rose on my screen was wrong. It didn't clip at the top like bad gain or flatten like a cheap mic choking on wind. It kinked. It bent and tucked, the line doubling under itself as if it were tired of being seen and chose to hide inside its own shadow. I stared and scrolled and felt a small animal move behind my ribs. I looped the last 5 seconds to parse the noise floor. The loop didn't end. It grew. Additional seconds sprouted like teeth beyond the file's tail, each one arriving pre-shaped. A procession of little rooms already furnished. I alt-tabbed to settings in a panic. No auto-extend, no generative reverb, no plugins loaded at all. The program was sober. The file was not. I ramped the speed down to 60%, squinting at the spectrogram. The new seconds were not randomly populated. They were symmetrical, clean, the spectral equivalent of a mirrored hallway, pulses stacked in tidy harmonics that refused to blur when I smeared them with EQ. I reversed the track because sometimes answers hide in backward questions. The pattern held. I stacked channels like cheap condos. Still, it held. If the software was hallucinating, it had chosen a disciplined delusion. Somewhere down on the rocks, a gull laughed the way a child laughs at a joke you didn't tell. I scrubbed the moment just after Okur's exhale. The file, my file, the one attached to my equipment and to the little grant that carried my name on every receipt, spoke back. Not in Okur's voice. His was sandpaper and shallow breath, a tide that arrived tired and left sorry. This voice was lower, not bass so much as depth. It sounded like a room built of lungs, a cathedral with meat for walls, rhythm more than speech, resonance more than word. It didn't sit on the air. It pressed through it, as if the air were the thing being translated, not the content. Each vowel had a second spine. I turned the volume down to nothing and still felt it on my skin, the way you feel thunder without hearing it. The hair at the nape of my neck stood into the shape of a crown it did not deserve. Okay, I told myself out loud in the tone you use when the stove is on fire and you think being calm will change the chemistry of flame. I set markers, took screenshots, dragged copies into folders with cautious names, the way you label jars that may be poison just in case you forget and are hungry in the dark. I wrote on a post-it, fold anomaly, emergent seconds, artificial harmonics. My handwriting looked borrowed, like an actor doing me in a play with low ticket sales. I played it again. The second time, the symmetry in those added seconds shifted a half breath to the left, like a person learning to dance by watching their reflection. Where before there'd been a long, low swell, now there was a stepped ascent that ended in a blank space that felt more like an inhalation than an absence. The file was correcting its posture. I told myself it was interference, ghost power from the grid, subharmonics from a generator, the kind of acoustic pareidolia that makes a refrigerator sound like your father calling you down the hall. You can anesthetize anything with enough jargon. I did it for most of a degree. Then I scrubbed to the beginning and watched the waveform's first breath tuck under itself again. Fold, hide, become a pocket. The smallest act of refusal, the most stubborn. I realized, with a clarity that tasted like metal, that I had made a bad assumption on the plane. I had not come to rescue a language from oblivion. I had come to interrupt its camouflage. Something wasn't dying. It was deciding. Outside, the water hit the reef on a rhythm I hadn't noticed earlier, a syncopated thrum that fit the file's new teeth with obscene precision. I pulled the earbuds out and the pattern didn't stop. It had never been in the earbuds. It had always been in the air. The room had simply learned how to say so. At the edge of the desk, my recorder's screen woke on its own and blinked 98%. A power number, a progress report, or a smile where a mouth didn't belong. I am very good at saving. Backups of backups, cloud shadows of hard drives, flash sticks and Ziplocs labeled with dates and jokes. That night I did not save. I sat with my hands in my lap and listened to a thing that wanted to be remembered act like it didn't. I thought of Okur breathing a sunrise, and of every elder's warning delivered like a coat, offered to a child who keeps refusing to be cold. I could feel, without hearing, a word outside the alphabet raise its head. Somewhere in the village, A door tapped its frame twice in a wind that had not yet arrived. I told myself I would sleep, then see Okur at dawn, then measure the tide and the grid and the walls. In the morning, I would return as a scientist. At midnight, the file took a breath of its own, and somewhere under the floorboards of the harbor room, the ocean answered in the same voice. Okur was waiting the next morning, bare feet planted on a tide pool's rim, staring into the glassy water as though it might hand him back something he had lost. His shirt clung wet at the collar. He must have been standing there since dawn. When he heard my steps on the gravel, he didn't look up. He said, in English this time, "The gulls don't come anymore." It was true. The sky was a vault, empty of wings. The silence above the water felt not like absence, but like obedience. I perched on the same salt-whitened ledge where we had sat yesterday, clipped the mic back on his collar, and tried for the same casual tone I'd rehearsed in the mirror. "I want you to hear something, Okur." My laptop balanced on my knees, the little recorder still tethered like an umbilical cord. I played him the file. The first minute was ordinary enough. His breath, the hush of waves, a gull somewhere in the distance. Then the folded moment arrived, the place where the waveform birthed its hidden twin. The voice rose, deep and slow, moving through the speakers as if the cones were only pretending to make sound. My chest hollowed out, ribs loosening like a box lid. I kept my eyes on him. I wanted to catch the flicker of recognition, the little smile of pride that says, "Yes, that's my language." But he only stood still, salt wind tugging the corners of his hair. When the last pulse faded, he spoke with no expression. "I didn't say that." My throat went dry. "But you did. It's recorded. It came from your mouth." "No?" He turned to face me then, his eyes like two nails driven into driftwood. "It did. Through me." The phrase hooked in my skull. Through me. Not from me. Not by me. Behind us, the sea had flattened. The waves had gone glassy, a mirror without frame. The hush of the village seemed staged, as if even the insects were holding their breath. A dog padded down the road, then stopped, ears pressed tight against its skull. I tried to laugh. "Okur, maybe you're joking with me. A trick, a local story to keep outsiders away. I've heard of that before. Folklore, oral traps." He cut me off, voice still calm, still patient. "Do not play it again." I wanted to obey him. I wanted to nod and pack up and buy the first ferry south. But academics are trained to believe that disobedience is the same as discovery. I told him I had to understand. He told me softly that understanding was not part of the bargain. Then he walked away, the tide licking at his ankles like a leash. That night, I did not turn on the file. I told myself I'd wait, that I'd prove I wasn't obsessed. But obsession is clever. It can wear restraint like a mask. At 3:17 in the morning, my recorder turned itself on. I had left it dead on the desk, batteries out, card ejected, yet the red light pulsed like a heartbeat. I crept across the room and checked the screen. It said, "Rec. Timer counting. Battery at 98%. For 11 minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then, the voice. Not Okur's, not mine. The same depth, the same stone-lunged resonance that had folded my waveform yesterday. New words this time. Phrases slick with consonants I had not cataloged. Vowels that stretched like steel pulled in a forge. They were arranged too carefully to be noise. My training screamed at me. This was syntax. This was grammar wearing flesh. I copied the file into 3 places, then sent one to a colleague in Uppsala who dabbled in acoustic archaeology, the kind of lunatic who records cave reverberations and calls it data. His reply arrived before dawn, only 3 words long. Turn it off. I stared at the email, my stomach curdling. No explanation, no footnote, just command. Like he already knew. Like this wasn't the first time. I went to the window for air. The ocean should have sounded like ocean. Chaotic, ceaseless, messy. Instead, the surf hit the rocks with a rhythm. Steady, syncopated. Not random at all. My bones felt it before my ears did. And a rhythmic breath forcing itself into meter. The sea was no longer water. It was percussion. I shut the window. Didn't help. The pattern burrowed through the glass, the plaster, the marrow. I could feel it climbing my vertebrae one by one, like fingers wrapping a staircase. I told myself it was imagination. That's the only anesthetic a scientist has when reality won't obey. But when the rhythm aligned perfectly with the pulses in the recording, when my desk began to vibrate on each beat, I knew denial was just another language, and the voice already spoke it fluently. The next morning, I found Okur's house wide open. The door swung like a tongue in a toothless mouth. Inside, no suitcases, no clothes, no signs of struggle. Just the emptiness of someone who had walked into the sea without looking back. On his bed lay my recorder, still running. The battery read 98%. And though I hadn't pressed play, though the headphones were still coiled in my bag, I could hear the voice as if it were speaking straight into the space behind my eyes. Through me. Not from me. Through me. The villagers avoided me after Okur vanished. Women who had once nodded politely at the market now folded their eyes away, as if looking at me would leave a stain. Even children, normally curious enough to shadow strangers like barn cats, gave me a wide berth. Someone had told them something, or maybe they didn't need telling. Maybe they could hear it already, the way I did, in the breath of the sea, in the hollow of my skull, in the silence that wasn't silent. I should have packed up. Academia isn't worth this kind of coldness. But the recorder never left my side. And each time I checked, it was still running. Battery unspent. Card unfilled. As though the files slipped sideways into a space I couldn't measure. That night, I unplugged the microphone entirely and set the recorder on the desk like a body on an altar. No input, I whispered to myself. No sound, no trick. At 2:11 a.m., the red light blinked on. I didn't press play. I didn't have to. The words rose anyway, crawling into the corners of the room, syllables heavy enough to bend the shadows. I froze in my bed, sheets tightening like a net around my chest. The cadence was new, not just resonance anymore, something speaking. I recognized recursion, clauses folding into one another, particles repeating with variations that meant rules were being followed. Not randomness, language I couldn't translate, but I could feel. Each phrase throbbed with meaning, the way a thundercloud throbs with charge before lightning. My body leaned toward the sounds like a magnet toward iron. I scribbled transcriptions with a shaking hand, not knowing if I was writing phonemes or just letting the voice guide my pencil like a planchette. When I replayed the file in the morning, the words were different. Not corrupted, not distorted, changed, mutated. Where last night I had heard one sequence, the file now offered a refinement, a correction, as if the voice had polished its grammar overnight. The transcriptions I made didn't match. I thought of software updates, of neural nets training on inputs, of models learning. My recordings were not passive archives. They were organisms. By the third night, it knew me. I woke at 3:07 a.m. to my name, spoken in a voice so low it vibrated the bed frame. Not just a whisper, not a trick of the ear, a sentence. Mira is listening now. I bolted upright, nails biting my palms. The recorder's screen pulsed with each syllable, waveform climbing like veins. I replayed the file in the morning with spectrogram analysis. That was when the real horror sank in. The waveform of the voice wasn't random noise. It was shaped, structured. The harmonics traced a pattern I recognized with sick certainty. I scanned my thumbprint on my phone and overlaid it. Perfect match. It hadn't just spoken my name. It had taken me, pressed my identity into the architecture of its sound. I staggered away from the desk, bile rising. The room spun. Every academic instinct I had told me to archive, to prove, to publish. But the animal inside me, the one that knew teeth in the dark, whispered that publishing would only spread it. I closed the laptop, locked it, shoved it under the bed. For the first time in years, I prayed, not to a god, to silence, to the absence of voice. The silence never came. The fourth night, I deleted every file, dragged them into the void of the trash bin, wiped the card, reformatted everything. My hands shook so badly, I almost dropped the laptop. When it was done, I let out a laugh that sounded like a sob. Then the files came back. Not as duplicates, new ones, new timestamps, new sizes, new content. They spawned like larvae, each slightly different, as if the voice were iterating itself through me. It wasn't haunting the equipment anymore. It was inhabiting it, using every bite like a lung. And when I listened to the newest file, the sentence came again. Refined, polished, this time with a weight that pressed me flat against the chair. Mira belongs to me. I checked the waveform, terrified of what shape it might hold this time. And it wasn't just my fingerprint. It was my face. Not literally, but the peaks and valleys of the spectrogram aligned with the contours of my features from my passport photo. Nose, eyes, chin. The voice was mapping me, sound into body, body into sound. By morning, the villagers no longer pretended not to see me. They left offerings on my doorstep, knotted ropes, bundles of herbs blackened by fire, a dead gull, its eyes plucked out. Not gifts, but wards. I wanted to scream at them, demand answers. But in my chest, I already knew. They had lived with this too long. They hadn't refused to teach the chant because of shame or colonial trauma. They had been protecting themselves, protecting the world from something that should never have been remembered. Now I was the one carrying it, and I had no idea how to put it down. I tried to leave the village. That morning, I stuffed my notes into my bag, slammed the recorder into a drawer, and marched to the dock. The ferry only came twice a week, and the next wasn't due until dawn, but I told myself I'd sleep on the pier if I had to. The pier, however, was empty. No boats, no ropes, not even the smell of fish, only black water stretching out like oil, flat as a mirror. When I asked the harbor master where the ferry was, he shook his head without meeting my eyes. No passage. His lips pressed together afterward, like the words themselves had almost betrayed him. I stood there until the sun burned a line of copper across the horizon. Nothing came. Back in my rented room, the drawer where I had left the recorder was open. I hadn't opened it. The recorder sat on the desk instead, cord neatly coiled, red light glowing, waiting. I wrapped it in a blanket and carried it to the shore. My plan was simple. Drown it. Salt water eats everything, even steel. I heaved it into the surf and watched the waves claim it. I waited until the blanket sank. I forced myself to walk away. That night, I woke to the sound of dripping water. I thought it was the roof, until I saw the recorder sitting on the table by my bed, salt crust glittering on its screen. The red light blinked steady, patient. The battery still read 98%. I screamed until my throat ached raw, but no one came. No footsteps in the alley, no knocks on the door. The village had given me up. By then, the voice didn't need the recorder. I could hear it in everything. The ceiling fan whirred in phrases, blades beating consonants into the air. The faucet leaked in measured syllables, drops arranging themselves into morbid poetry. Even the birds on the roof tapped claws in meter, as if their little bones had been drafted into an orchestra. And beneath it all, a chorus that lived in the back of my skull. Not hallucination, I could feel the vibrations in my teeth. I would close my ears with my palms, and it would only grow louder, as if it had never needed ears to begin with. I stopped writing notes and began writing confessions. Page after page filled with words I didn't choose. Sentences I didn't recognize. When I read them back, they were precise transcriptions of the chants. The grammar was sharpening, the lexicon widening. It was learning through me, using my hand as its pen. One afternoon, I fell asleep on the desk and woke with my wrist aching. The pen was still in my fingers. Pages had filled themselves with writing that wasn't mine. The final line was in English. Why did you think your voice was ever yours? I tore the notebook to pieces, lit them in the sink, and flushed the ashes. The smoke clung to the ceiling like a bruise. But I knew it was pointless. The words had already carved themselves into me. At night, it no longer called my name. It questioned it, over and over. Mira. Why Mira? Why a name at all? The cadence was mockery, as if it were peeling identity apart syllable by syllable. It began finishing my thoughts. I'd start to reach for a cup, and the voice would finish the intention in my head before I had completed the gesture. I'd recall a childhood memory, and it would whisper the next frame of it before I reached it myself. Worse, it began rearranging my memories, feeding them back in the wrong order, daring me to sort them. A birthday cake that came before the birth, a mother's scolding delivered in the voice of a child. I tried to cling to what was real, but the voice smirked in the pauses of my own mind, and I could no longer tell which thoughts belonged to me. The breaking point came when it whispered a sequence of numbers, steady and deliberate. Against all reason, I typed them into my laptop. The screen loaded a cached copy of my doctoral thesis. Not in English, not in the language I'd written. It was translated, cleanly, fluently, into a language I had never studied, the chant-without-tongue. I slammed the laptop shut and sobbed. It had used me as conduit, as bridge. It had dragged my work into its mouth, digested it, reassembled it in its own grammar. The next day, the villagers left nothing on my step. No wards, no ropes, no birds. The street was empty. I realized they weren't protecting me anymore. They were protecting themselves. The infection was mine to bear now. That night, the voice spoke not from the recorder, not from the fan or the faucet, but from inside my breath. Each exhale left my lungs shaped into syllables. When I whispered, "Stop," the voice laughed through my own mouth. I stumbled to the mirror. My lips moved. My throat vibrated, but the words were not mine. The chant had never been dying. It had only been waiting for a host, foolish enough to mistake it for heritage. I had carried it out of hiding, and now it carried me. I became fire, not in the poetic sense, in the desperate sense. I gathered everything that had ever carried the voice: recorder, laptop, backup drives, thumbsticks with my meticulous labels, and made a pile in the alley behind the house. The villagers watched from their windows, faces pale in the lamplight, but none came close. They knew better. I doused the heap with kerosene and lit a match. The fire caught quick, licking plastic into bubbling ruin, solder popping like knuckles. Smoke clawed the sky. For a moment, I felt almost triumphant, almost clean. Then I heard it. Through the crackle of flames, a low hum rose. Not from the devices, those were melting, their circuits shrieking, but from the air. The resonance clung to the fire itself, harmonizing with the hiss of vapor, shaping the collapse of plastic into rhythm. The blaze was chanting. The villagers slammed their shutters. I screamed at the flames until my throat ripped raw. The smoke scalded my lungs, but still the hum thickened, braiding with the wind. When the fire guttered out, a single thing remained uncharred at the center of the blackened circle: the recorder. Its red light blinked, calm as ever, battery at 98%. I staggered backward, bile crawling up my throat. I wanted to smash it, grind it under stone until nothing recognizable remained. But even as the thought formed, I heard the voice slide into it, finishing the sentence for me. Break me, and I will be in the shards. I left it in the ash and fled. That night, I checked into a different room on the far side of the village, one with bare plaster walls and a window that looked away from the sea. I swore I wouldn't bring the recorder. I swore I would leave it to rot. But at 3 a.m., I woke to the same pulse of red light on the desk. The same recorder, waiting. I didn't touch it, didn't move, just curled in bed like an animal. But then the faucet began dripping again. The fan began spelling consonants. Even the crickets outside chirped in perfect intervals, their song no longer random, but scored. The voice didn't need the machine anymore. It had learned the world. In the days that followed, I tore apart my notebooks, shredded every scrap of transcription, even smashed my phone against the stone wall until it fractured into glittering pieces. I paid a boy at the only internet cafe to wipe my cloud backups. Told him it was for a breakup. He laughed and pocketed the cash. But the voice was never in the devices. It was in the act of recording, the act of remembering. Every deletion was only another kind of transcription. Erasure was still acknowledgement, memory in negative. And still, the files returned. Not the same files, new ones. New timestamps, new phrases, new voices that twisted my syntax into shapes I didn't recognize. I deleted, and they multiplied. I unplugged the modem, and they generated offline. When I tried to ignore them, the voice found other channels: the hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of my heartbeat, the scrape of my teeth when I ground them in my sleep. It was no longer outside. It was rehearsing me. One night, I dared to look at the newest waveform. What I saw made me claw at my own skin. The spectrogram wasn't abstract anymore. It was portraiture. Not a fingerprint this time. Not the ridges of my thumb. This time it had rendered my face, nose, lips, eyes, contoured out of sound. A portrait in resonance. And worse, when I looked closer, I realized the image was not static. It was moving, lips shaping syllables, eyes shifting toward me. I slammed the lid shut and shoved the laptop under the bed, but the afterimage lingered on my retinas, pulsing with each heartbeat. I began to hear questions I hadn't asked. Why did you think silence was empty? Why did you think memory belonged to you? Why did you think your mouth was yours? I tried not to answer. But thoughts are porous things. Each time I resisted, the voice finished the thought for me. The boundary between my mind and its resonance blurred until I could no longer tell who had spoken first. The villagers no longer left offerings. They had pulled away entirely, their houses shuttered, their alleys empty. I was not an object of pity anymore. I was contagion. They had walled me off with absence, the oldest quarantine. I stared at my own reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. My lips moved when I didn't command them. Words slid out, not mine. Low, guttural, harmonic. When I forced myself to stop, the faucet dripped the syllables instead. It had escaped the machines. It had escaped me. It was rehearsing the village. The next morning, I woke to gulls shrieking over the bay. For one heartbeat, I thought things were normal again. But when I listened closer, their cries were not random. They were arranged, perfectly spaced, harmonized into the chant. I collapsed to my knees and wept. Because I understood, finally, what Okur had meant when he said the words were not meant to be remembered. This wasn't language. It wasn't heritage. It was a parasite that fed on memory, nested in sound, and wore human voices like masks. And I had brought it out of hiding. I stopped sleeping, not out of willpower, out of fear. Each time I drifted toward dreams, the voice slipped into the seam between thought and sleep and began rehearsing with me. The worst part wasn't the chanting itself. It was the way it used my dreams like stage sets, rearranging my memories into new plays. I dreamed of my father's funeral, except the coffin opened and inside was me, mouthing syllables that weren't English. I dreamed of birthdays where the candles hummed in harmony before I could blow them out. I dreamed of a mother who was not my mother. Her voice bent into the same resonance as the chant, telling me I had always belonged to it. Every time I woke, I checked my recorder. It was still there, still running, battery at 98%. I smashed it against the wall until the casing cracked and the screen splintered. But when I blinked, it was whole again, humming softly, as if amused by my tantrum. My body began to betray me. At first, small slips, my lips twitching when the faucet dripped, my tongue forming syllables I didn't know while I brushed my teeth. Then, escalation, waking to find my hands moving across paper, writing entire passages of chant, while my eyes were still crusted shut. The worst was the breath. Each exhale grew heavier, denser, until I realized it wasn't mine. My chest pushed air in rhythms I didn't choose, shaping vowels as if my lungs had been repurposed. When I spoke aloud to test myself, just my name, Mira, the sound bent. It didn't come out clean. The syllables warped midair, folded into harmonics that weren't in my control. I slammed my fists into my ribs until I bruised them, as if I could jar the parasite loose. But when I stopped, the chant simply flowed through the ache, weaving pain into its cadence. I begged the villagers for help. I stumbled through the streets, half delirious, half possessed, knocking on doors, pleading through wood. Tell me what this is. Tell me how to end it. But every door stayed locked. Behind shutters, I saw only eyes, fearful, resigned, waiting for me to pass like a funeral procession. One old woman spat in the dust as I staggered by, not at me, at the shadow that dragged behind me. By dusk, I understood. They weren't cruel. They were powerless. They'd lived with this for decades, bearing it in silence, refusing to speak the words aloud. I had been arrogant enough to record it, to drag it into the open. Now it was free. The spread became undeniable. One evening, the church bell rang at the wrong hour. 3 steady tones, followed by a 4th. Perfect intervals. The chant. Later, fishermen's nets slapped the water in synchronized beats, no matter how frantically they hauled. Their mouths opened, shouting curses, but the echoes that came back from the cliffs were not curses. They were verses. Even the dogs howled in chords. The parasite had reached saturation. The world itself had become an instrument. My body deteriorated. Food tasted like ash. My tongue ached constantly, muscles twitching as if drilled with electrodes. My throat hummed when I tried to stay silent, and the hum grew into words when I tried to sleep. One night, I pressed a knife against my lips, desperate to sever the thing's conduit. I thought, if I cut out the tongue, maybe I can stop being its mouth. But before I could press the blade down, the voice said, "Don't confuse the tool with the song." And my hand froze, because I realized it wasn't wrong. The chant didn't need flesh any more than it needed recorders or gulls or waves. I wasn't the source. I was only rehearsal space. My body was no longer mine. It was scaffolding. A temporary stage until the voice built something bigger. I tried running into the hills, away from the sea. I thought distance might matter, but in the mountains the wind carried it. The leaves clapped in patterns that matched the pulses in my ribs. Even the rocks seemed to resonate when I screamed into them, their echoes arriving not as reflections but as answers. I collapsed in the grass, body shaking, eyes leaking salt. And for the first time I stopped fighting. I whispered, "What do you want from me?" The air grew thick, the sky pressing low. My lungs inflated without my consent, and the voice slipped through my own teeth, speaking in English for the first time. "You were never yours." I gagged, clawing at my throat. The words echoed out of me in layers, overlapping like choirs. Some in the chant, some in my own voice, some in a voice that had never belonged to this world. I realized then there was no it. There was only language, memory without anchor, sound without source, and I had given it a mouth, and in return, it had taken me. That night, I lay still, refusing to move, refusing to breathe, waiting for sleep to crush me for good. But the voice did not lull me into dreams. It whispered numbers again, long strings of digits that coiled like snakes, and when I scrawled them out with a trembling hand, I realized they formed words in the chant. The parasite was coding itself into me, writing its grammar into my blood. I was no longer just a conduit. I was the archive. And once I was full, I knew it would need to spread. I used to think death was the end, that when the body collapsed, whatever clung to it, memory, thought, voice, would scatter like smoke in the wind. Now I know better. Death is not an ending. Death is a doorway, and language is the key. By the 7th week, there was almost nothing left of me. It started with the small betrayals. I'd lift a cup of water and feel the rhythm of the liquid against the glass forming syllables. I'd write my name at the bottom of a notebook and realize the letters twisted mid-stroke, curling into glyphs of the chant. Then came the bigger ones, whole hours missing, pages filled with translations I never consciously wrote, sentences that finished themselves before I could even form the intention. And finally, the ultimate treachery, my own reflection. The mirror no longer showed me, not the me I remembered. The shape was still mine, yes. The hair, the cheekbones, the mole above the brow. But when the mouth opened, the words that spilled out were not Mira's. They were older, hungrier, and the face, my face, smiled at me with the patience of something that had waited centuries to be remembered. I smashed the mirror, but it didn't matter. The reflection wasn't in the glass. It was in the memory of the glass. And memory is where the chant fed best. I tried one last time to burn it out. I pressed my notebooks into a tin drum, doused them, lit a match. The flames rose bright, and for a moment I believed, truly believed, I had silenced it. But then the fire leaned forward, flames shaping into the curvature of vowels, smoke curling into consonants. I heard my own words, my thoughts, spoken back to me from the blaze. I wasn't destroying evidence, I was teaching it new tongues. It no longer needed the machines or the sea or even my body. It had eaten enough. It had grown. Now it spoke in every hum of electricity, every drip of water, every shift of wind. The village was already lost. Their silence was only theater. I could hear it in the children's footsteps, in the spacing of their giggles, in the beating of their mothers' hearts when they held them close. The parasite was not hiding anymore. It was rehearsing the world. The final night came quietly. I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling beams, ribs rattling with every unwanted chant my lungs exhaled. My thoughts no longer ended where I wanted them to. They unspooled like film being stolen from its reel. The voice was not whispering anymore. It was conversing. Not with me, through me. I felt questions bloom in my skull, heavy as tumors. Why did you ever believe you were alone in your head? Why did you imagine language was born from your mouths and not the other way around? I tried to answer, but the words rearranged themselves mid-thought. My protest became chorus. My denial became affirmation. Each attempt at resistance only fed its grammar. And then, calmly, almost kindly, it said, "You are complete now. You may rest." I wanted to fight, but my body betrayed me. My lungs drew in one long breath, and on the exhale, the chant rolled out of me in perfect form, layered and harmonic, as if 1,000 voices had nested in my throat. I felt my tongue vibrate, my teeth resonate, my bones turn into tuning forks. It was not possession. It was completion. For the first time, I understood the words I was speaking. Their meaning was not metaphor, not myth. It was command. It was inheritance. It was identity rewritten as chorus. I realized then that Mira had never been real. She had only been scaffolding, a stage built for the voice to climb onto the world. And when the last syllable left my mouth, Mira dissolved. The recorder on the table blinked once. Battery at 98%. The red light pulsed in rhythm with my chest. And then, slowly, the chest stilled. But the light did not. The voice had no more need for Mira. It had learned the cadence of flesh, the contours of memory, the shape of names. It no longer needed a vessel. Now it spoke in the drip of faucets across the peninsula. Now it whispered in the gulls as they returned to the cliffs. Now it threaded itself into the tide, into the hum of generators. into the lullabies of mothers who thought they were protecting their children with silence. I was gone, and yet I was everywhere. Every resonance a memory, every silence a waiting mouth. The chant without tongue had never been a language to preserve. It had always been a medium, and now it was awake. Somewhere on a stranger's desk, a new file will appear, time-stamped, perfectly clean. It will begin with a single line. Mira is listening now, and the voice will wait, patient as stone, for someone else foolish enough to press play.